Every soldier of Super Earth knows the ritual by heart. The briefing room fills with warm light, the propaganda reel begins its cheerful automated hum, and somewhere between the images of smiling civilians and footage of burning bug nests, a voice cuts through with the kind of absolute confidence that only comes from a government that has never once genuinely questioned whether it might be wrong about something. The mission is clear. A colony world has fallen under Tyranid infestation. Super Earth needs it back. And so, as the deployment system locks into its launch sequence with the cheerful precision of a machine that has done this 10,000 times before, another Helldiver climbs into his drop pod and prepares to deliver democracy at terminal velocity. His name does not matter. In the culture of Super Earth, names are secondary to function. What matters is the armor sealed across his body, the stratagems loaded into his wrist beacon, and the absolute certainty baked into every corner of his conditioning that this mission, like every mission before it, is winnable. The pod seals around him with a pressurized hiss that he finds almost comforting at this point. The countdown begins. He closes his eyes, steadies his breath, and runs through the words that have carried him through more combat drops than he can count. For Super Earth, the launch cannon fires. For the first several seconds, everything feels completely normal. The acceleration presses him deep into his seat with the familiar, almost reassuring brutality of a combat deployment. Outside his reinforced viewport, stars stretch into silver lines as the ship's cannon sends him arcing toward the planet below. The colony world fills the glass ahead of him, blue-green and ordinary, wrapped in the thin shimmer of an atmosphere that promises breathable air and productive tactical conditions. He is already running mental calculations, deployment zones, primary stratagem priorities, likely swarm concentrations along the eastern perimeter. Then something changes. There is no adequate way to describe what a warp breach looks like from the outside if you have never been trained to recognize one. Imperial navigators spend decades in meditative isolation learning to sense the trembling, unreliable border where real space ends and the immaterium begins. And even they describe the experience in terms that drift dangerously close to madness. From inside a drop pod with no navigator, no Geller field, and absolutely no theological preparation of any kind, the encounter is considerably more immediate. The space ahead of the pod simply tears open. Not fractures, not cracks. It tears, the way old fabric gives way when pulled apart at its most exhausted seam. And behind the tear there is nothing that human eyes were ever designed to process. Colors with no name. Light that moves in the wrong direction entirely. A sound that is not sound but registers in the body like every grief you have ever carried arriving simultaneously at full volume. The Helldiver's instruments collapse into chaos. His beacon array flickers and cuts out completely. His orbital communication link drowns in static. The pod spins, accelerates in impossible directions, decelerates, then accelerates again through angles that have no counterpart in any physics his training covered, and through all of it the soldier inside does the only thing his conditioning has prepared him for when systems fail completely. He grips his harness. He locks his body. He does not scream, not because fear has abandoned him, but because screaming means accepting that something has gone wrong beyond the range of fixable. And a Helldiver holds that acknowledgement at bay until the mission is confirmed over. The warp spits him out. There is no grace in it. The pod does not ease back into real space. It is expelled through the boundary the way a stone is thrown through a window, tumbling end over end through a sky that is the entirely wrong color, above a world that is unquestionably the wrong world. Through the cracked viewport, the Helldiver can already see that the planet below bears no resemblance to his briefing target. The atmosphere is thick and brown, choked with ash columns that climb for kilometers. The city below, or what remains of it, pulses with the ragged, uneven glow of something that has been burning too long. He can see fires everywhere. And above the fires, silhouetted against the brown haze in shapes that evolution never intended, vast biological structures move with deliberate patience. The pod strikes the ground with enough force to crater a city courtyard, splitting the ancient cobblestones of a hive street that has not seen direct sunlight in living memory. The impact throws the Helldiver hard against his harness, and for several long seconds the world is nothing but ringing silence and the slow drip of coolant from a cracked intake pipe. Then, with the mechanical resolve of equipment engineered specifically to survive this level of punishment, the hatch blows outward and the soldier inside steps into the open air. The air tastes like scorched iron and old blood. It smells the way a battlefield smells when it has been a battlefield for so long that the concept of it ever being anything else has become genuinely unimaginable. The Helldiver runs a rapid physical assessment, confirms no critical damage, and surveys his landing zone. He is standing in a courtyard surrounded by thick walls reinforced with scavenged iron sheeting and sandbags piled to 3 meters. Around him, in the particular frozen silence of men who have just watched a metal cylinder fall from the sky and destroy 20 meters of ancient cobblestone, stand soldiers. They wear green flak armor over heavy brown uniforms. They carry lasguns with the casual grip of people who have been holding weapons for so long the weapons have become part of their body. Their faces hold the expression of men who stopped being surprised by anything years ago, but who are currently making a sincere effort to revise that position. The Helldiver looks at them. They look at the Helldiver. From somewhere beyond the nearest wall, something biological and enormous screams in a register that no natural throat should be capable of producing. The Helldiver engages his helmet speaker. He straightens his posture. And he delivers the only opening statement his training has ever prepared him to give when arriving at a combat zone occupied by what appear to be fellow soldiers. He tells them they have been liberated. The guardsmen stare at him. One of them, a sergeant with a jaw that looks sculpted from quarry stone and eyes that abandoned hope sometime around the 2nd year of the siege, turns his gaze slowly from the armored stranger to the sky above, then back to the stranger, then to the sky again. Behind the reinforced wall, something very large is moving closer. The sergeant spits on the cobblestones, adjusts his grip on his lasgun, and says nothing at all. Because in the Imperium of Man in the 41st millennium, in a galaxy where war has been the permanent and unbroken condition of existence for longer than most species have been alive, there is genuinely no adequate reply to a man who drops out of a spatial anomaly and announces liberation as though it is a thing that has ever once happened here. The first thing the Helldiver did after establishing that no one was immediately shooting at him was attempt to contact Super Earth Command. He raised his beacon communicator, cycled through the standard frequency bands, ran the emergency handshake protocol twice, and received in return the one thing a Helldiver is trained never to accept as a final answer. Static. Not the soft static of interference, but the deep, structureless roar of a signal that has nowhere to go because the infrastructure it was designed to reach is, at minimum, an entirely different region of the galaxy. He tried again. Static. He checked his equipment for physical damage, found none that was relevant, and tried a 3rd time. The static did not change its position on this matter. He filed this away under problems to solve later and turned his attention to the soldiers around him. They had not moved. The sergeant with the stone jaw was watching him with the focused attention of a man trying to determine whether the situation in front of him fell under his personal jurisdiction or whether it needed to go significantly further up the chain. 2 younger guardsmen behind him were trading glances with the careful body language of people who very much wanted to ask a question but were not sure if asking it would get them in trouble. The Helldiver approached them with the open, squared-off posture of someone trained to project allied confidence in the field, and began his standard cooperative engagement protocol. He asked them about their unit, their command structure, their mission objectives, their resupply situation. He asked these questions the way a man asks questions when he genuinely expects usable answers, with a pen of thought ready to take notes and a mental organizational framework prepared to slot the responses into a coherent tactical picture. What he received instead was an education. The sergeant, whose name was Tomas Vath, explained things slowly and with the particular patience of a man who has had to explain the fundamental realities of the universe to new recruits before, and has developed strong feelings about how long it takes. He told the Helldiver about the Imperium of Man. 10,000 years old, a million world, an emperor who sat on a golden throne at the center of the galaxy, neither truly alive nor truly dead, his consciousness burning like a beacon across the warp to guide the ships of mankind through a dimension that wanted to consume them. He told him about the enemies of humanity, the Xenos, the heretic, the demon. He explained that the Tyranids assaulting this world were not a local infestation but the leading edge of a biological fleet larger than most solar systems, and that their purpose was not conquest but consumption, total and absolute. The Helldiver listened to all of this with the expression of someone running a complex calculation. What he heard, processed through the interpretive framework that Super-Earth propaganda had installed over years of conditioning, was something like this. A strongly centralized government. A citizen population organized entirely around the service of the state. An unending multi-front war against monstrous external enemies that threatened human survival. A military culture built on sacrifice, hierarchy, and the absolute primacy of the mission. Brutal? Certainly. Efficient? But familiar in its essential shape. He had been raised to see the galaxy as a battlefield between the forces of democracy and the forces that wanted to destroy democracy. And while the Imperium of Man used different language, the operational structure looked, from a sufficient distance, not entirely unlike home. He told the sergeant that the Imperium sounded like a very committed democratic society. Sergeant Veth stared at him for a long time. He told the Helldiver that the Imperium was not a democracy, that it had never been a democracy, that the suggestion would, in many of the billion administrative offices spread across 1,000,000 worlds, qualify as a prosecutable heresy, that the Emperor was not an elected official but a divine being, the spiritual father and sovereign of all humanity, whose will was law, not because a vote had been taken but because the alternative was extinction. He said all of this in the flat, tired tone of a man explaining water to someone who has never seen rain. The Helldiver nodded slowly. He said that sounded like a very effective propaganda framework for maintaining unit cohesion during extended campaigns. Veth looked at the two younger soldiers behind him. They looked at the floor. What followed over the next several hours was a conversation that would have been funny under almost any other set of circumstances. The Helldiver asked questions about the Imperium with genuine curiosity and received answers that became progressively more alarming. The Adeptus Mechanicus, the Inquisition, the Penal Legions, the practice of executing soldiers who retreated without orders, the concept of the God Emperor's divine light as a tactical resource. The Helldiver processed each of these revelations with the analytical calm of someone cataloging useful operational data, occasionally nodding in a way that suggested he was finding more common ground than anyone around him was comfortable with. The Guardsmen, for their part, had not reached a consensus on what to make of him. The younger ones were fascinated, in the cautious way that soldiers become fascinated by anything unusual enough to briefly interrupt the grinding sameness of siege warfare. The older veterans watched him the way experienced men watch an unknown piece of equipment, with the specific concern of people who have learned that things which appear useful have a tendency to explode unexpectedly in the 41st millennium. One private, a young man named Castor, who had been on this wall for 4 months and had developed a comprehensive personal catalog of things to be afraid of, finally asked the question that everyone else was avoiding. He asked the Helldiver where exactly he had come from. The Helldiver told him, Super-Earth, the Helldivers program, the war against the Tyranids and the automatons, the glorious ongoing liberation of the galaxy in the name of managed democracy. Castor processed this. Then he asked very quietly if managed democracy was the name of the Emperor. The Helldiver thought about this longer than the question probably deserved. He said that managed democracy was more of a governing philosophy, but that if it helped, the people who ran it were also completely certain they were right about everything. Veth decided the stranger was either insane, heretical, or from somewhere so far outside imperial jurisdiction that standard theological classifications simply did not apply. He was not sure which answer he preferred. Behind the walls, the Tyranid advance continued its patient, grinding approach, and the debate over the precise spiritual status of their new visitor was, for the moment, going to have to wait. The assault came at what passed for dawn in a hive city under siege, which is to say it came with no light improvement whatsoever. Only a slight change in the quality of the darkness and a dramatic increase in the volume of biological screaming from beyond the outer walls. The Tyranids did not announce their attacks the way human armies do. There were no trumpets, no orders broadcast across Vox channels, no visible command structure issuing coordinated instructions. What happened instead was a sensation, reported by every guardsman on every wall simultaneously, of something shifting in the direction of the enemy. Like pressure changing before a storm. Like the moment before a wave breaks when the water pulls back from the shore. And then the wall shook as the first wave hit it, and the screaming that had been distant became very immediate. The Helldiver was already moving. The guardsmen around him scrambled to their firing positions with the disciplined efficiency of soldiers who had survived enough of these assaults to have the response deeply embedded in muscle memory. Lost fire began cracking from the parapets in long, stuttering bursts. The wall held for now. The creatures hitting it from outside were hormigons, the smaller bioforms, fast and bladed and extraordinarily numerous, swarming up the rockcrete face with the adhesive confidence of organisms that had been optimized over millions of years specifically for this purpose. The Helldiver assessed the situation in approximately 3 seconds. He identified the density concentration at the eastern gate as the critical pressure point, the area where the sheer weight of bodies was most likely to overcome the wall's structural integrity first. He moved to that position at speed, already cycling through his stratagem loadout with the practiced efficiency of someone who has run this calculation hundreds of times before in different geological configurations with different enemy types. The principles translated: mass enemy concentration, fixed defensive position, finite defensive resources. The tactical mathematics were at their core familiar. He deployed an automated sentry turret from his equipment pack, locking it to a firing position on the parapet with the clamps built into its base, and activated it. The turret swept the gate approach, identified the hormigont concentration, and began firing with a consistent mechanical efficiency that the last guns of the guardsmen, useful as they were, could not match for sustained output. The creatures died and rose. The pressure at the eastern gate dropped measurably. The guardsmen nearest to him stopped firing for exactly 2 seconds to stare at the turret. Then they resumed firing, because in the middle of a Tyranid assault there is a practical limit on how long you can afford to be surprised. Then the Helldiver called an orbital strike. The stratagem beacon left his hand in a clean arc, trailing its activation signal, and landed at the coordinates he had calculated, 60 meters beyond the wall, at the base of the primary approach channel, where the main body of the hormigont wave was funneling toward the gate. The strike came down 6 seconds later. A column of kinetic and explosive force that opened a crater 30 meters wide in the hive street and eliminated a biological mass that would have taken the guardsmen the better part of 20 minutes to grind through at current firing rates. For approximately 4 seconds the assault stopped, not because the Tyranids had made a tactical decision. The concept did not apply to them in any way that a human commander would recognize. They had no fear response, no survival instinct that operated at an individual level, no general watching from a command post who could look at the situation and decide the cost was too high. What happened was simpler and in its own way more disturbing. The hive mind registered the disruption at this point in its advance and rerouted, like water finding a new path around an obstacle, like a river that does not mourn the stone that diverts it. The 4-second pause was not hesitation. It was recalculation. And then the next wave arrived. Different shapes, organisms that had not been in the first wave, forms optimized for dealing with fixed defensive positions rather than simply overwhelming them with speed and numbers. Ravenous, burrowing up through the courtyard floor inside the wall perimeter. Gargoyles descending from above, bypassing the gate entirely. The guardsmen adapted. They had done this before. They knew what a second wave looked like, and they knew what it meant, which was that the first wave had been an assessment, a biological probe sent not to breach the wall, but to gather information about what defending it. The information had now been gathered and returned to the hive mind, which had sent something more specifically appropriate. The Helldiver fought with an efficiency that the guardsmen would talk about later when there was time to talk. He moved between pressure points without being directed, identifying where the line was thinning and arriving there before it broke. He used his stratagems with a precision that felt almost wasteful to veterans accustomed to rationing every available resource, but that produced results they could not argue with. He called fire support on the Ravenna emergence points before the creatures had fully surfaced. He used a resupply beacon to restock his ammunition, which was a concept that the guardsmen found so profoundly enviable it briefly approached the sacred. By mid-morning, the assault had been broken. Not permanently. No assault in this city was ever broken permanently. But the wave had receded, the casualties had been counted, the wall was still standing, and the courtyard was full of dead Tyranids and the specific tired relief of people who had survived something that was going to come back. Sergeant Veth found the Helldiver cleaning his weapon near the eastern gate and stood beside him in silence for a long moment. Then he said that the stranger fought well in the flat, precise tone that veteran soldiers reserve for compliments that they mean completely, but have no interest in inflating. The Helldiver thanked him and asked about resupply timelines for the defensive line. Veth told him, gently and without embellishment, that this was not a war of timelines, that there were no resupply ships coming that would change the fundamental situation, that they were not holding this hive city in preparation for a counteroffensive that would drive the Tyranids back. They were holding it because holding it was what soldiers of the Imperium did, for as long as they could, because the alternative was to stop holding it. The Helldiver looked at the eastern wall and the new cracks in it, and the stains on the cobblestones, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said he understood. He did not yet, but something in his voice had shifted, very slightly, from the bright certainty of earlier in the day, and Veth, who had heard that particular shift in voice before, noted it and said nothing. The reports reached the command spire of Hive Solnys 3 days after the drop pod had cratered Courtyard 17 in the lower Hab districts, and by that point they had accumulated enough conflicting details to make the duty officer responsible for compiling them genuinely uncertain how to classify what he had written. An unknown armored soldier had arrived via unidentified orbital insertion technology. He carried weapons and equipment of no recognizable pattern. He had demonstrated combat effectiveness against Tyranid forces that the duty officer, choosing his words carefully in the knowledge that this report would be read by people who would make significant decisions based on it, described as remarkable. He had also told Sergeant Tomas Veth of the 4th Helsian Infantry that the Imperium sounded like a committed democracy, which the duty officer included in the report because he was thorough and flagged as potentially requiring theological review. The report moved upward through the command structure with a speed that was unusual for a military bureaucracy famous throughout the segmentum for its ability to delay almost anything indefinitely. It moved quickly because it contained a category of uncertainty that the Imperium's command structure was specifically designed to escalate without hesitation. Unknown technology, unknown origin, unknown elite. These 3 characteristics, appearing together in a single report, had a specific destination in the chain of command, and that destination did not share offices with the regular military. The Inquisition became aware of the Helldiver on the 4th day. Inquisitor Yelena Drath was a woman who had spent 30 years professionally, suspicious of everything that did not fit neatly into the established categories of threat, and she had developed over those decades a reliable instinct for which unusual reports were genuinely unusual, and which were simply the product of soldiers whose trauma had made them unreliable witnesses. She read the compiled account of the armored stranger in Hive Solnys 3 times. She noted the corroborating testimonies from multiple independent guardsmen who had witnessed the same things from different positions. She noted the physical evidence, the impact crater, the spent stratagem casings of unfamiliar manufacture, the sentry turret that had been recovered after the assault, and was currently making several of her colleagues very interested. She boarded a transport to Solnys the same day. On the transport with her, separated by professional courtesy and mutual suspicion, was a delegation from the Adeptus Mechanicus that had received the same report through different channels and had experienced what their new spheric communications protocols rendered as a collective state of urgent technical curiosity. The sentry turret had been the piece of evidence that most engaged them, not because of its lethality, which was modest by the standards of Imperial weaponry, but because of its power cell configuration, which was unlike anything in the Mechanicus's extensive catalogs of known technology, and its targeting logic, which appeared to function without a Mechanicus-blessed machine spirit of any conventional kind. The Magos leading the delegation, a senior tech priest named Orthavus who had filed enough research requests in his career to have lost count, had spent the transport journey in a state that his biological colleagues would have recognized as excitement, rendered through the flat tonal register of someone whose emotional expression had been substantially replaced with augmetics. He had 17 specific questions about the power cell already formulated. He had cross-referenced the Sentry's construction against 200 years of recovered Xenos technology samples and found no matches. He had also, quietly and without informing Inquisitor Drath, sent an independent preliminary report to his Forge world requesting authorization for extended study of whatever they found. Below them in the hive, the Helldiver had no idea any of this was happening. He was, on the 6th day of his stay in Hive Solnys, doing what he had been doing every day since his arrival. He was fighting. Another assault had come the previous morning, this one a sustained multi-point push along the northern and eastern walls simultaneously, a tactical coordination that the Guardsmen recognized as a sign that the hive mind had finished its assessment of the defensive position and was now applying pressure in a considered way. The Helldiver had contributed to the defense of 3 separate wall sections in the course of 12 hours, moving between them with a strategic awareness of the overall defensive picture that was either the result of exceptional individual initiative or of a command perspective that none of the Guardsmen could quite account for. What the Guardsmen had noticed, discussed, and carefully not reported through official channels yet was that the stranger had begun to carry a quiet authority in the tactical spaces he occupied. Not the authority of rank or divine sanction. Not the authority that came from an Inquisitor's rosette or a Commissar's coat. The practical authority of someone who was consistently, demonstrably right about where the pressure would come from next and what to do when it arrived. Soldiers follow that kind of authority in combat with an instinct that bypasses ideology completely. And the mixed defensive line in the lower Hab districts had begun, without formal acknowledgement, to orient itself around the Helldivers' assessments in ways that would have required a great deal of paperwork to justify through the standard Imperial chain of command. Sergeant Veth was aware of this. Veth was also aware that when Inquisitor Drath arrived, she was going to have opinions about it. She arrived on the 7th day, entering the command level of the Hab District garrison with the particular economical energy of someone who has traveled a significant distance for a specific purpose and intends to complete it efficiently. She interviewed Veth first. She asked precise questions. She listened to the answers with a quality of attention that Veth had encountered before only in confessionals and court-martials, the kind of attention that makes you feel that everything you say is being simultaneously evaluated and stored. She asked about the technology, the behavior, the statements about democracy, the combat performance, and the drop pod, which had been moved to a secure location and was currently making 3 separate groups of people very nervous for very different reasons. Then she asked Veth what his personal assessment was. Veth considered the question seriously. He told her that in 4 years of defending Hive Solnys against a Tyranid siege, he had met soldiers who fought out of faith, soldiers who fought out of fear, soldiers who fought because the commissar behind them made the alternative unattractive, and soldiers who had stopped knowing why they fought and were simply continuing because stopping required a decision they no longer had the emotional resources to make. He had not, until 7 days ago, met a soldier who fought because he appeared to genuinely believe the situation was solvable. Drath asked him if he thought the stranger was dangerous. Veth said that the stranger had personally saved the Eastern Gate during 2 separate assaults and that his turret device had probably accounted for more Tyranid casualties than an entire squad over the same period. He said that if the stranger was dangerous, the danger appeared to be directed exclusively at the enemies of the Imperium, which in his personal experience was not the most common pattern for genuinely dangerous things. Drath wrote something in her data slate. Then she went to find the Helldiver herself, walking through the lower Hab corridors with Magos Orthavis at her shoulder, trailing questions like a priest trails incense, and thinking about a soldier from nowhere who had arrived in a galaxy built on 10,000 years of carefully managed despair and had not yet had the courtesy to become appropriately hopeless. There was a moment, on the 14th day, when the Helldiver climbed to the highest accessible observation point in the Hive City and looked out beyond the walls for the first time since his arrival, and understood something that no amount of Guardsman testimony had fully conveyed. He had been given permission for this observation by Inquisitor Drath, who had concluded after 6 days of interviews, equipment analysis, and quiet investigation that the stranger was not a Xenos agent, not a heretic, and not a product of any faction currently active within Imperial space or known beyond its borders. She had classified him provisionally as an anomaly of unknown origin, which in the taxonomy of Inquisitorial threat assessment was considerably better than most of the other available categories. She had not cleared him for unrestricted movement, but she had granted him supervised access to the observation deck, partly because she was curious what he would do with the view, and partly because she suspected he needed to see it. He stood on the deck for a very long time without speaking. What lay beyond the walls of Hive Solnys was not a battlefield in any sense that the word had meant to him before this moment. A battlefield was a defined space, a contested zone with edges, with a front line that moved according to tactical success and failure, with a shape that could be drawn on a map and communicated in a briefing. What lay beyond the walls was something different in kind, not just in scale. As far as he could see in every direction, across a landscape that had once held farmland and secondary settlement structures and roads connecting them, the ground was consumed. Not burned, not bombed, consumed. The Tyranid biomass had covered the terrain the way a living organism covers a wound, and in place of the topography that had been there before, there was now only the alien landscape of the hive fleet's feeding process. Structures of chitin and organic matter the size of buildings. Movement everywhere, constant and purposeful and impossible to track individually because there was too much of it. Spore towers rising at intervals, releasing clouds of biological material into the atmosphere with the steady industry of factories. The sky, which had never been clear since his arrival, was darker over the consumed areas, the ash and spore combining into a permanent biological overcast. He asked how far the consumption extended. His Mechanicus escort, a junior tech adept assigned as part of Drath's supervision arrangement who had been using every moment of close proximity to attempt discreet scans of the Helldivers' equipment, paused its scanning and told him 3 full continents were consumed. A 4th was in the final stages of bioconversion. The 2 continents that still held significant human population were those upon which the hive cities sat, and of those hive cities, 4 had already fallen. Solnys and 6 others were still defended. The planetary population before the invasion had been 17 billion. Current estimates place the surviving population in the defended zones at somewhere between 800 million and 1.2 billion, with the uncertainty reflecting the difficulty of conducting accurate census operations during an active Tyranid siege. The Helldiver was quiet. He had fought bugs for his entire operational career. He understood infestation. He understood the tactical reality of enemy forces that reproduced quickly, adapted to opposition and prioritized consumption over strategic territory control. He had liberated dozens of worlds from Tyranid infestation, had called the final orbital strikes that sterilized bug-held zones, had watched the mission complete screen appear, and had genuinely felt the satisfaction of a problem resolved. He understood bug wars. He had believed, at some level that was now examining itself with considerable discomfort, that this was a larger version of the same thing. It was not. The difference was not scale in the numerical sense, though the scale was beyond anything he had previously encountered. The difference was permanence. A Tyranid infestation had a terminus. It could be reduced to a point where the remaining population could not sustain itself, and the planet could be declared clear. The Tyranid hive fleet did not work that way. It did not have a population that could be reduced below a sustaining threshold, because the fleet above the planet was generating new bioforms continuously, and the process of consuming the planet's biomass was itself feeding that generation. The more the fleet ate, the more capable it became of continuing to eat. There was no cleanup operation to plan for. There was no mission complete condition that applied to a world with a hive fleet in orbit. This realization did not arrive all at once. It settled in over the course of the observation, spreading through his understanding the way cold settles into a building when the heating fails. He stood on the deck and watched the consumed landscape and ran the mathematics in his mind with the same trained efficiency he applied to tactical problems. And each time he completed the calculation, he arrived at the same answer. The kind of answer that his training had never prepared him to receive, because Super Earth's entire operational culture was built on the foundational certainty that the answer would always be different. There was no version of this where he called the final beacon and watched the completion screen appear. He turned away from the observation window. He walked back down through the hive with the tech adept trailing behind him, through corridors packed with civilian population seeking shelter from the biological assault outside, past makeshift medical stations where guardsmen and civilians lay in long rows that extended out of sight around corners. He walked past shrines to the Emperor, improvised from whatever materials were available, covered in offerings left by people who had no tactical options remaining, and were directing their hopes somewhere metaphysical because the material options had narrowed too far. He walked past a group of children sitting in a corridor, doing what children do in catastrophes, which is playing, because the understanding of what is happening has not yet fully arrived in the way it arrives for adults. He stopped at the children and stood there for a moment. He thought about Super Earth's recruitment reels, the cheerful animations of liberated civilians celebrating the arrival of democracy, the mission-complete screens with their clean green graphics, the voice of the briefing officer telling him the galaxy was being won, planet by planet, and that his contribution to that winning process was valued and patriotic and correct. He thought about 17 billion people reduced to less than 1 billion in the time since this fleet had arrived. He thought about the sergeant's words on the first night, delivered with the flatness of total conviction. This was not a war of timelines. There were no resupply ships coming that would change the fundamental situation. When he found Sergeant Veth in the Eastern District garrison a few minutes later, he did not say anything right away. Veth looked at his face and recognized something there, the particular expression of a man who has just been told something that cannot be untold. He had seen it many times. It was the expression of a soldier whose understanding of the situation has caught up to the reality of it. Veth poured 2 cups of recaf from a pot on the garrison stove, set one in front of the Helldiver, and sat down across from him. He said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 soldiers sitting with a truth that does not require commentary, only acknowledgement, before the next alarm sounds, and they both go back to the wall. They arrived on the 16th day, and the city knew they were coming before the transport landed. It was not announced through official Vox channels. It was not the sound of the transport itself, which was still several kilometers out when the knowledge began moving through the defensive lines like a current through water. It was the quality of change in the behavior of the people around him. The guardsmen on the wall stood differently. The officers in the garrison spoke in lower voices. The civilian population in the corridors, who had developed over months of siege, the particular emotional radar of people whose survival depends on reading their protectors accurately, sensed the shift and responded to it with a collective stillness that was not fear and was not joy, but was something more fundamental than either, something closer to awe held in reserve against the possibility of hope. The Helldiver asked Sergeant Veth what was happening. Veth told him that the Adeptus Astartes had come to Solnys. The Helldiver did not have a reference for this name. Veth told him the other name, Space Marine. At this, the Helldiver's expression shifted slightly in the way expressions shift when a word connects to existing mental architecture. He had heard of Space Marines. The concept existed in some form even at the cultural remove of Super Earth, passed through the distorted filter of stories too large and too old to have been kept entirely clean, arriving as legends stripped of specifics. Giant warriors, engineered past the limits of ordinary humanity, the elite of all elites. He told Veth that this sounded like a welcome development. Veth looked at him carefully and said that Space Marines were not quite what most people expected when they finally stood in front of one. He understood what Veth meant when the transport bay opened. They were wrong in the way that certain things are wrong when reality exceeds the capacity of expectation. Not wrong in a bad sense. Wrong in the sense of too much. The 7 warriors who descended the transport ramp wore ceramite plate the deep blue of a sky at the edge of night, and they moved with the absolute economic authority of bodies that had been refined over decades of genetic and biological intervention into instruments with a single precise purpose. They were not large the way athletes are large, through cultivation of natural potential. They were large the way a piece of architecture is large, through intentional construction toward a specific load-bearing function. The smallest of them stood a full head above the tallest guardsman present and was broader across the chest by a proportion that made the guardsman look approximate by comparison. Their faces, where visible, held expressions that the Helldiver found difficult to read initially. He was accustomed to reading faces shaped by the complete range of human emotional weather, the fluctuations of fear and hope and exhaustion and brief relief that cycled through soldiers on active fronts. These faces did not cycle. They held a focused stillness that was not the stillness of suppression, of emotion being held down, but the stillness of something more fundamental. As though the entire category of emotional fluctuation had been reduced, through training and genecraft and decades of continuous warfare, to a background process running beneath the surface of a consciousness entirely organized around something else. Their captain, identified by the laurel marking on his pauldron, stopped at the base of the transport ramp and surveyed the defensive position with the practiced efficiency of someone who has assessed thousands of them. His gaze moved across the fortifications, the troop dispositions, the structural condition of the wall, cataloging all of it in seconds and filing it into whatever tactical architecture lived behind those still blue eyes. Then his gaze stopped. It stopped on the Helldiver. The Helldiver, for his part, had been watching the captain with the professional interest of a soldier assessing an unfamiliar allied unit. He registered the scale, the weaponry, the bearing, the quality of movement, and found all of it impressive in the specific way that a person who takes warfare seriously finds excellence in a fellow practitioner impressive. When the captain's gaze settled on him, he met it directly, which was either the correct instinct or a significant social miscalculation, depending on the particular Astartes captain involved. The captain walked toward him. The crowd of guardsmen between them moved aside without being asked. He stopped at arm's length from the Helldiver and looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they cannot immediately classify. Not with hostility. Not with suspicion in the way Inquisitor Drath's attention had carried suspicion. With something that was closer to genuine curiosity, which on a face built to project impassivity was a more significant thing than it might have appeared. He asked the Helldiver who he served. The Helldiver told him. Super Earth. The Helldiver's program. Managed democracy. The captain was silent for a moment. Then he asked what managed democracy was. The Helldiver told him it was a form of governance built on the principle that every citizen of Super Earth had the freedom to make the choices that the government agreed were correct, and that defending this principle from enemies who wanted to take it away was the highest expression of civic virtue. He said this with complete sincerity, as he always did, and watched the captain's face for a response. The captain said nothing for several seconds. Then he said, in a voice that held the same quality of absolute calm as the rest of him, that this was interesting. He said it the way a person says interesting when they are filing the information away for later consideration, rather than resolving it in the present moment. He told the Helldiver his name. Antonius, captain of the 5th Company of the Iron Warden chapter. He told him that he had received reports of an unknown soldier of considerable combat effectiveness and had expected to find something explicable. He had not found something explicable. He found this acceptable. He asked the Helldiver if he intended to continue fighting. The Helldiver said that was not in question. Antonius looked at him for another moment with that same quality of careful study, as though measuring something that did not have a standard unit of measurement available. Then he gave a single nod, turned back toward the wall, and walked to assess the defensive lines, and the crowd of guardsmen closed again behind him. Sergeant Veth appeared at the Helldiver's shoulder. He told him quietly that in his 4 years on this wall, he had never seen a Space Marine captain stop to speak to anyone below the rank of command officer. The Helldiver considered this. He said that Antonius seemed like a good soldier. Veth looked at the enormous blue-armored figure moving along the parapet above them and agreed that this was probably technically accurate, in the way that calling a volcanic eruption a geological event was technically accurate. The weeks passed in the way that time passes in siege conditions, which is to say unevenly, with days that were long beyond reckoning and moments that compressed hours into seconds, and through all of it the signal from Super Earth never came. He kept trying, not obsessively. Not with the frantic energy of someone whose entire sense of self depended on the answer. But at the end of each day, after the fighting and the tactical debriefs and the long hours of maintaining equipment that had not been designed for indefinite continuous use without proper resupply, he would sit in the corner of whatever space he had claimed as a temporary base and raise the communicator and cycle through the frequencies and listen to the static and then set it down again. It became a ritual, not a hopeful one. More like the kind of ritual people maintain not because they believe in the outcome, but because the act of maintaining it is itself a form of continuity, a thread back to a version of themselves that still existed somewhere on the other side of a warp breach. On the 23rd day, he accepted quietly and without ceremony that no one was coming. He was alone in the 41st millennium with no extraction timeline, no mission parameters, no command structure, no propaganda reel, and no voice of authority telling him what the objective was. The framing structures that had organized his entire operational existence had been removed, and what remained underneath them, without the scaffolding, was the question that the scaffolding had been designed to prevent him from ever having to ask directly. What are you actually doing this for? The answer he had given automatically his entire career was for Super Earth, for managed democracy, for the liberation of the galaxy. These were real answers. They had been real enough to put him in a drop pod hundreds of times. They had been real enough to sustain him through combat situations that would have destroyed someone who was fighting for nothing but survival. He did not doubt that they had been genuine when he gave them. But they were answers that required a context to inhabit, a framework of mission and return and continuation, and that framework was gone. He sat with this for 2 days. On the 3rd day, he went back to the wall. The assault that morning was a probing attack along the southern perimeter, a smaller force testing a section of wall that had been partially damaged in the previous week's engagement, and not yet fully repaired. The Helldiver arrived at the southern wall before any formal order had been given to reinforce it, took a position between 2 guardsmen whose names he had learned in the previous week, and engaged the advance with the same efficiency and tactical awareness he had brought to every previous day of fighting. The guardsmen on either side of him fought. The probe was repelled. The south wall held. Afterward, a young woman who had been a loading technician for a heavy bolter team before the bolter team was reduced to 1 functioning member and 2 who could not currently serve, sat against the wall with a ration pack she was not eating and watched the Helldiver clean his weapon. She asked him something that cut through approximately every philosophical formulation he had been running for the past 3 days, with the precision of something genuinely simple. She asked him what he fought for now. He looked at the courtyard around him, the civilians moving through it. A family group sheltering under an overhang, 2 adults and 3 children arranged in the particular compact formation of people using each other's proximity as a substitute for walls. An old man sitting in a doorway performing some repair task on a piece of equipment with the focused patience of someone who has decided that keeping one thing functional is a contribution worth making. A medic moving between the wounded with supplies that were insufficient but were being deployed with the maximum possible effectiveness anyway. He told her he fought for them, not as a political abstraction, not for the concept of their freedom or the theoretical value of their survival to some larger cause. For them specifically, the people in this courtyard and the people in the corridors below and the people on the other walls and all the people behind all the walls across the remaining hive cities of a world that had already lost most of itself. He told her this with the same directness he used for tactical communications, without decoration, because it was simply true and did not require decoration. The young woman looked at him for a moment and then went back to her ration pack. In the following days, something shifted in how he moved through the hive. It was not visible in any single behavior. It was visible in the accumulation of small choices. He spent more time in the civilian corridors than his tactical assignments required. He learned the names of guardsmen he had been working alongside for weeks but had not yet named. He began a habit of checking on the medical stations at the end of each fighting day, not because there was anything tactically useful about this, but because the people there existed and their existence was the thing he had decided mattered. Captain Antonius observed this change without commenting on it directly. He mentioned to Sergeant Veth during a command briefing held without the Helldiver present that the stranger's combat effectiveness had increased rather than decreased since the apparent realization that his return was indefinitely delayed. He said this with the same quality of level interest he brought to all observations. Veth said that in his experience this was unusual. Most soldiers, when the external structure of their motivation was removed, found their performance declining. Antonius considered this and said that the stranger appeared to have replaced his external motivation with something internal, and that this was, in his assessment, more durable. He did not say it was also more dangerous, in the way that all genuine conviction is dangerous, capable of going in directions that no external command structure can predict or contain. He thought it. He watched the Helldiver from the parapet, moving through the hive below with the quiet, purposeful energy of a man who has found a reason that does not require permission to be true, and he thought it very clearly. He found the beacon on the 38th day in a storage cache in the lowest accessible level of the eastern hab block, beneath 2 meters of structural rubble that had come down in an assault 2 weeks prior and had not yet been cleared because the clearing teams were needed elsewhere. He had been down there for a different reason entirely, checking whether a collapsed section of the lower tunnel system had opened a breach that the Tyranids could exploit as an infiltration point. The breach was real and was already being prepared for defensive reinforcement. The beacon was incidental. He found it when his boot caught the edge of a supply crate partially buried under the rubble, and he moved enough debris to read the markings on the side and understood immediately what he was looking at, because it was his own technology. The crate had come down with his drop pod. He had not been aware of a secondary supply cache attached to the external bay, but the logistics team on the Super Earth ship had apparently loaded one as standard procedure for extended planetary deployments. It had broken free on impact, fallen separately, and been buried. Inside the crate was 1 orbital strike beacon, 1 stratagem pack with resupply capability, and enough emergency field rations to sustain 1 person for approximately 2 weeks. He sat with the beacon in his hands for a long time. It was not an ordinary orbital strike beacon. The markings on the housing identified it as a high-yield extended ordnance package, the kind reserved for Helldiver deployments on worlds where the standard precision strike package was insufficient to address the threat concentration. The effective radius was substantially larger than anything he had used since his arrival. Used correctly against the right target, it would not create a crater in a hive street. It would eliminate a threat concentration of significant scale, level a city district, end a battle that had been continuing long enough to have become simply a feature of the landscape. He brought it to Inquisitor Drath. She studied it for 3 hours, with Magos Orthavis present, neither of them asking the question they were both thinking until the technical analysis was complete. Then Drath asked it directly. She asked what he intended to do with it. He showed her the tactical maps he had been developing over the past 3 weeks. He pointed to the northern processing district, the area of the hive that had been structurally compromised in early fighting and then progressively infiltrated by Tyranid tunnel organisms until it now represented a biological bridgehead inside the defensive perimeter, rather than simply a wall under external pressure. The district was no longer meaningfully inhabited. The population had been evacuated to the inner hab levels several days into the siege. What remained were structures, and inside those structures, burrowing through the foundations and the pipes and the old industrial infrastructure, a Tyranid vanguard force that was consuming the district from the inside and would, within days if not hours, breach through into the population corridors. The standard defensive response was to fight through the district structure by structure, which would cost more guardsmen than could be spared and would still, given the rate of Tyranid reinforcement through the tunnel network, probably not succeed in full. Drath and the military command had been aware of this for 2 days and had been attempting to find an alternative that did not involve abandoning that section of the perimeter entirely. The Helldiver told her the beacon would solve it. 1 strike, precisely placed, would collapse the entire district, seal the tunnel network beneath it under several hundred meters of rubble, and eliminate the vanguard force completely. The resulting debris field would actually improve the defensive situation on the northern perimeter by replacing a structurally compromised inhabited district with a rubble zone, which was both easier to defend and provided no internal structures for bioforms to shelter within. Drath told him that the effective radius he had described encompassed a zone that would also kill anyone inside it. He told her he was aware. She told him that guardsmen would not be ordered to make this call. That directing an orbital strike onto your own position, while not unknown in Imperial military history and in fact carrying a specific doctrinal endorsement in certain texts, was not something that command structures ordered of individual soldiers. They could ask. They could not order. He told her she did not need to ask. There was a long silence in the room. Orthavis was completely still, which for a being whose mechanisms were always performing some background function was its own kind of statement. Drath looked at the Helldiver with the expression she reserved for moments when her ability to classify something had reached its limit and she was choosing to sit with the unclassified thing rather than forcing it into a category. She asked him why. He thought about the family in the courtyard, the old man with the equipment, the children in the corridor, the guardsmen whose names he now knew. He thought about Sergeant Veth, who had explained this galaxy to him over recaf without flinching from any of it, and who had kept fighting for 4 years inside a situation that his own honest assessment said had no favorable terminus. He thought about the civilians in the population corridors who were not soldiers and had not chosen this and had no stratagems available and were surviving entirely on the actions of people who had decided that their survival was worth fighting for. He told her it was the mission, not an order, not a directive from Super Earth Command, not a propaganda obligation or a patriotic calculus. The mission was the people behind the walls, and completing the mission required this, and so he was going to do this. He set the beacon's coordinates. He entered the activation sequence. He moved to the northern district with Veth, who had refused without discussion to not be present, and 3 guardsmen who had made the same refusal, and they cleared the district together in the 90 minutes before the strike window arrived. He sent the others out at the 60-minute mark over their objections. He stayed. At the 30-second mark, he activated the beacon and closed his eyes. He did not think about Super Earth. He did not recite any doctrine or propaganda. He thought about the children in the corridor and he held that image and he was still. The strike came down. They found him in the rubble 3 hours later. He was alive because of a combination of factors that Megas Orthavis would later spend considerable time attempting to quantify, including a structural void created by a collapsed load-bearing section above him, the extraordinary impact resistance of his armor at ranges it was technically not rated for, and a degree of physical resilience that the medical officer attending his recovery quietly classified in her report as anomalous and did not push further. He was alive, in the assessment of everyone who pulled debris off him, by a margin that suggested the galaxy had not yet finished with him, which in this particular galaxy was not a comfortable thought to sit with for very long. Sergeant Veth was the one who reached him first. He had been on the perimeter of the debris field since the strike, directing the recovery effort with the kind of quiet determination that does not look like hope but functions identically. When the Helldiver's arm emerged from beneath a slab of collapsed ceiling and the gauntlet moved, Veth sat down on a piece of rubble and did not say anything at all for a moment, which was more expressive than most things he had said in 4 years. The northern perimeter held. More than that, it held better than it had at any point since the siege began. The rubble field created by the strike proved exactly as defensible as the tactical assessment had suggested, and the elimination of the vanguard force in the tunnel network beneath the district bought the remaining defensive lines a period of reduced pressure that the command structure used with the efficiency of people who understood that periods of reduced pressure were finite resources to be invested rather than rested in. 2 secondary breaches were repaired. 3 squads that had been committed to continuous wall defense rotated off for the first time in 11 days. The medical station moved its least critical patients to better facilities. The Helldiver recovered in 4 days, which was faster than his injuries warranted by any standard medical reasoning, and spent those 4 days in a cot in the garrison medical bay, receiving visits from people who did not have a clear explanation for why they were coming to visit him, but came anyway. The 2 young guardsmen from the first courtyard came. Castor, who had asked whether managed democracy was the name of the emperor, came and sat for 20 minutes without saying much. The young woman who had asked him what he fought for came and brought a ration pack, which he accepted without comment, which was the correct response. Captain Antonius did not visit the medical bay. On the 2nd day of recovery, the Helldiver looked up to find the Marine captain standing in the doorway of the ward, which was not quite the same thing as a visit, and maintained a useful distinction between the two. Antonius looked at the Helldiver for a moment, gave the same single nod he had given at their first meeting, and walked away. The Helldiver found this entirely satisfactory. On the 5th day he was back on the wall. The siege continued. This was not in question. The Tyranid fleet above the planet had not been reduced, the consumed continents had not been restored, and the strategic situation for Hive Solnis and the other remaining Hive cities was not significantly improved by the elimination of one vanguard force. The war in the 41st millennium did not operate according to the kind of mathematics where one extraordinary act changed the fundamental equation. What had changed was the immediate tactical situation in one district of one city on one world, and the people in that city were still alive to inhabit the situation, and that was the actual result. The Helldiver appeared to find this sufficient. Something had changed in him after the strike, but it was not what the change looked like from the outside. From the outside, it might have appeared to be acceptance. The adoption of the grimdark realism of a galaxy where hope was a strategic liability and endurance was the only honest response to existence. It was not that. He did not endure. He continued with the same quality of forward momentum he had carried since his first day in the courtyard, the same orientation toward the next problem and the next solution. The same refusal to allow the scale of the negative to become the primary fact of the situation. The difference was that he was doing it now without the framework of super-Earths, reassurances behind him, and without the expectation of a mission-complete screen at the end of it, which meant he was doing it purely from whatever it was inside a person that continues when everything external that supported the continuation has been removed. Stories spread through the hive the way stories always spread in places where official information is scarce and human beings need something to talk about. That is not the siege. The stories grew in the telling, as stories do. And by the time they had moved through all levels of the hive, from the defensive walls to the deepest civilian shelter levels, the armored stranger had acquired in the telling some qualities he did not possess and lost some details that were less narratively useful. But the core of the story remained consistent because it was simple and true. A soldier had come from somewhere no one could identify. He had fought alongside the people of this city without being asked to and without requiring an ideological framework that aligned with imperial doctrine. And when the moment came that required the most complete kind of commitment, he had given it without hesitation and had walked out of the rubble afterward. In the corridors of Hive Solmis, people began to repeat a phrase. Not loudly, not as a chant or a prayer or anything that would attract official doctrinal attention. Quietly, the way people repeat things that have not yet found their place in the official language of their world, but that feel true enough to keep. Guardsmen said it to each other before going onto the wall. Civilians said it in the shelters as a thing between hoping and deciding. Even Sergeant Veth, who had spent 4 years stripping sentiment from everything because sentiment was a resource the siege could not afford, said it once to the empty eastern corridor at the end of a long watch. For democracy. Said without certainty about what democracy meant in this galaxy, or whether it meant anything at all here, but said with something more useful than certainty. Said with a specific quality of defiance that arises in people who have been told the situation is hopeless, and have chosen not to make that the deciding fact. The galaxy remained what it had always been, ancient in its cruelties, but in one ruined district of one hive city on one besieged world. Soldiers stood on a wall and watched the darkness and carried something with them that the darkness had not put there. And in the 41st millennium, that was not nothing.